Hey guys, Mustached here, and I'm here to review Bioshock Infinite. So, once again, thank you to my PayPal supporter for suggesting the Bioshock series all throughout. As per usual, I will split this up between two different sections, that being story and then gameplay, and separating those scores as per usual, unless there is no story, but in this case there is, so with that being out of the way, let's dive right in and be as objective as possible. So, I was pretty wary of Bioshock Infinite from the screenshots that I was seeing before downloading. And jumping right into the story, we now follow Booker, a named character, who persists on going on this air trip and being baptized again on the holy lands of the skies above. Now, obviously, this is already a departure from Bioshock 1 and 2, which primary stories both take place underwater. Now, initially, I was like, okay, so they're not doing the underwater thing a third time. I'm gonna be cautiously optimistic and just see where the story goes from this new perspective and new environment. Why not, right? So I was willing to hear out the story. And while I would argue that the pacing at the beginning is a little bit on the slow end, there does seem to be a bit more theming around religion, race, and propaganda that does permeate throughout the middling portion of the video game. And by all means, I do think that that was when I was most interested in at least the world that this game was creating up in the air. But it doesn't really engage what the story is about. Again, this is more so building up the world, the things that you're seeing around you. So, again, while interesting, I would argue that this isn't where the story even begins, technically speaking. Which is a shame, I think, because I do think that those themes are pretty interesting and worth exploring on their own merit. However, the game finally begins, and then shits the bed immediately, quite frankly, as you come across one Elizabeth, who you later discover, after saving her in some time apart, that she can open these tears, these portals, if you were to explain it in another way. These tears can go up to other worlds or other timelines. Either way. And immediately, as soon as that started to be the story, it, to me, fell apart. Immediately, like I was suggesting. Now, here's the thing. I don't think that time travel alone can break a story per se, on its own. The issue with this particular story is that it takes far too late to introduce. And it just goes off the rails pretty shortly after it's even introduced. That being is that within that time span, you're now dealing with, again, time traveling to these other world/timelines. You then see how, these worlds are becoming more and more chaotic. There's war brewing, and then all of a sudden, they move this gun part to this other group, and then they find the other group dead, and it's like, oh no, we're gonna go after the Comstock, who is like the main antagonist of the game, or supposedly the main antagonist of the game. And all the while, your guy has been branded as the lost shepherd, or whatever they refer to you as. And again, you're time traveling, and in another world, you're like this hero or this rebel, and blah blah blah. Again, It's very too little too late here, if you ask me. But it gets worse. There's a giant bird that collects Elizabeth at a certain point, and then you reconvene later, and the bird is insisting upon getting to her throughout the latter portion of the game as well. It too can persist through time and space, I guess, and does so, reaching you, and, more bizarrely, Elizabeth, who seemed like she just wanted to be free, in a bizarre thing where the timeline goes ahead, all of a sudden later on in the story you meet a older Elizabeth when she's already captured, so this is like a time-futured Elizabeth. You see this war brewing, blah blah blah. And then you, like, travel back to, like, save her before they insert this nonsense or whatever. But it's already irrelevant because it already happened or whatever. So I don't know what the point of that was. And then it gets even more baffling. As then her character does this complete 180. Where now she's going on about, like, oh, how this is destiny and predestined and blah blah blah. And as you start to sink to the bottom of the ocean where Bioshock 1 and 2 take place, but now you're in this gateway world of it, where each door you go through, more and more of the the whole, the secrets revealed about how he, the main character Booker, you, were also simultaneously Comstock, aka her father, all along. Which is like, yeah, no, I don't care at this point. You didn't earn this whatsoever. Fuck off. So, yeah, that's about the long and short of it. And so, yes, I will say that this game's story fell apart. And again, I think if you wanted to script doctor this, you know, and if you wanted to keep the theme of time travel or whatever being like the core part of the story, I would argue again that you would have needed to do it earlier in the video game. And in terms of interacting with characters from previous timelines or whatever, I think it would be interesting in terms of keeping up with the more horror narrative from the previous two games, is that when you leave somebody behind, for example, that they will, from time to time in the game later on, even if you're in a different world or timeline, come back to you in a different form or whatever. Something along those lines. But the thing is that this game does all of that little too late, again, for me. And again, so much of it is set up, and so much of it is building up this whole new story. And again, the story doesn't feel like it kicks off in terms of like what the main thing is. Like, you do save her relatively early on, but like where that's going, like how he was trying to get into Paris, quote unquote, initially, and then lied about that and all this stuff. Like, none of that really seems to fit with the rest of the story in terms of like a narrative that is structured well. So that's where that lies. So if I were to give the story a score, I probably would say either a 2 or 3 out of 10. Like, this really is weak. And really poorly put together, but I'd probably push a 3, only because I think the world building is interesting enough to almost even push it to a 4. But that's as far as I would ever bring the score in terms of the story. With that being out of the way, let's turn to the gameplay. Now, in previous entries, that being Bioshock 1 and 2, you could have an entire weapon wheel of your numbered guns and your powers. Here, for whatever reason, you're down cut to 2 weapons and 2 powers, or primarily 1 power that you can sort of switch out whenever. Though you still have the 2 that you could switch between quicker, and then I think it stores the others away. So they downplay the weapon wheel in Bioshock Infinite, which is, in terms of gameplay, already extremely baffling. The second thing that they do is they turn what was clearly building up to be a horror game in Bioshock 1 and 2 and turning it into an action game. This is not a horror game whatsoever, though I think they tried to sneak in some horror elements in the very latter half of the video game. And it was like, well, where was this all along, you know? And it's like, sure, you're in the sky, but I think you can still build atmosphere, still build buildings, and have some more interiors that can come across as creepy or something. Heck, Silent Hill is very effective of making religion, you know, like a horror of its own, as it were, cultish. And again, there's themes of that here, but it doesn't feel like it ever bridges this story together, even though it comes back up at the end of the game. The connective tissue between what happens in the beginning and what happens at the end there's nothing about oh, is his faith being tested, or is he even a religious character? It doesn't seem like he is throughout what he's describing or whatever, so that doesn't even fit in that regard. Or if he's losing his faith or has lost his faith or whatever may have you, even those threads don't feel that present anyway, so regardless, it feels like very lazy writing, or very scattered writing, I should say, more so, because that's more so what this feels like in terms of where everything is when you look at the bigger picture. Anywho, back to gameplay. So, they lost a horror element, and now it's just a pure action game. And there are 3 enemy types. There's the generic shoulder guys, and then there are the buffered, well, I guess 4 enemy types, or maybe even 5, I think, if I were to technically separate all of them. You have your typical soldiers that will either gun or club you, or hit you with a weapon. You have your armored guys. You have your bird guy. You have your patriot bots, and yes, that's what they are. And last but not least, you have these bulky, machine-looking fellas that I think 2 or 3 of them in totality show up throughout the entire game. This being the horror element guy, I guess. Not quite a big daddy, if you ask me. Oh, and there was one other elemental type, but I digress. Point being is that there's obviously a little bit of variation of enemies, but it doesn't really matter. But in terms of the weapon wheel, I primarily stuck to the shotgun, which I will argue is the best shotgun in the Bioshock series. Bioshock's 1 and 2 shotguns just weren't impactful whatsoever. This one had the reloading animation that felt punchy, and the animations also simultaneously felt punchy, which in combination equated to this easily being the best shotgun. You can equip gear to give yourself stat boost. I gave myself a quicker reloading speed as one example equipment. I had another piece of equipment that would stagger shock the enemies from time to time, which is pretty effective when there were groups of enemies, because it would like shock transfer. And that about covers that. You can jump on these railings in terms of like traversal, and you can jump off and attack enemies if they happen to be below you when you're traveling in this way. And I will say, in terms of other elements, is that when you run low on ammo or health or anything for that matter, there's a really good chance that Elizabeth will just happen to find a piece of equipment. Now, I thought initially, oh, well, since this is an action game anyway, that they just made it so much more easier. However, due to the enemy's pure numbers, eventually, and even bigger enemies as I previously established, they do eventually, you will see in my Let's Play, do kill me like 3 times in totality throughout the game. Now, the punishment isn't too heavy. You don't lose too much progress. You like go to the beginning of the counter essentially, and then sort of move from that perspective. So that is sort of akin to Bioshock 1 and 2, just in case that fell out of line, but it's sort of in line, but just presented slightly differently. At any rate, with that being the case, I'm trying to think if there's any other parts of the gameplay that really stick out. You have your powers, as I mentioned, from the previous 2 games. You can have up to 2 stocked in your inventory as of use. I primarily used the lightning one when I got it. It seemed to be the most effective in terms of like staggering the enemy and keeping them at bay for a little bit. The enemies are pretty aggressive, but again, that only comes from the numberization of it and the, just that overwhelming sensation, in which again, Elizabeth will very oftenly give you stuff to like, oh, well, let's just make the game easier, for a longer period of time anyway. I think with that being the case, I think, and this could be accurate, I think she only finds stuff that's in the vicinity. Like, from time to time I'll hear her say, like, oh, there's nothing around, or something along those lines, so I'm not sure if that's true or not per se, but I would guess that that's what that means. So I guess that implementation is, I guess it keeps up the action and sacrifice of the horror element, or the gun, the gun ratio of like having to barely have any gun ammo, survival horror, that type of gameplay, because that is not the type of game that this is clearly going for. And unfortunately, it was very much so the case where the story was affecting the gameplay, as the story became this whole time travel nonsense, and now you're sort of reusing assets and repurposing the maps from prior, and seeing slight variants and so on and so forth. It just immediately made me like, okay, I gotta play more and more in the game. I want to just get through it more and more quicker. In terms of the saving system, the prior 2 games you could save it wherever you liked. In this game there's an autosave feature but no custom saving, so why that downgrade is beyond me. And luckily, though in a very messy way sometimes. The game will point you in the right direction if you hold up. And there was definitely a time later on in the game where you will see me just pressing, like, infinitely tapping the up button, and there was even an instance where I was getting lost or getting circled around for quite a little bit there in this particular area where there's all of these grapple points and this bigger area in terms of a combat zone, and it kept circling me around like 4 or 5 or 7 times or something along those lines. And then I finally like scooped up in a position that I had gotten to previously, that it, backtracking and all that, gotten back to, blah blah blah. So yeah, there were kind of annoying parts in that regard, in terms of like movement and stuff like that, and figuring out where the heck to go. So in terms of gameplay in its totality, I wouldn't say it's that much better than the story. I'd probably say a 5 out of 10. Like I said, it's a bit more action-oriented, so that's why I'm curving my score to compensate for it being a more action-oriented game. Because if this was a horror game and a survival horror game, this score would be lower. Because this does not meet that requirement whatsoever, obviously. But I digress. So, a very middling game, which is why I was pretty shocked as to see why this scored so high, but whatever. So, it's definitely the weakest of the franchise of Bioshock, but I do appreciate at least playing the first 2. And, getting paid to do the third is greatly appreciated in terms of, like, having a job and being compensated and all that good stuff. But man, was that started to mess with my mind in terms of, like, just wanting to get it over with. Anyways, that's my review of Bioshock Infinite, and if you ended up enjoying it, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head you over to my petition to help out smaller YouTubers. Second, to my PayPal, where you can help support me and my channel directly, and third, to my Discord server, where you can join Club, Shield, all that cool stuff. And until next time, everyone, bye-bye!